I love the names on this team. They have Sixto Sanchez, and they have my favorite name probably in baseball right now, Jazz Chisholm.
Showing emotion in baseball is terrible and should never be in the game.
It's weird how the dynamic works between sports.
But to win a championship, not only do you need great players on the court, but you need good chemistry, which takes time to develop.
Justin Fields is a all-time talent.
Corey Perry will give some veteran presence to the Canadians.
I feel like Luka will take that next step, and if he can get a three ball consistently around 35%, I feel like they could become a contender.
We can make jokes about you not being in Super Bowl for 20-something years, but...
What's up, everyone? This is Justin Goldman from the Goalie Guild and Lift the Mask, and you're listening to Outsiders Opinions with Austin and Kevin.
What's up, y'all? Welcome to our NHL Opinions of the Week. We talked about what the Four Nations meant and just like that was the best outcome. Now we're looking at the future and the impact. Because the man I was talking to before this, and we're just going to get started recording, Austin. There is the World Cup of Hockey, which you mentioned was the last time it happened in 2016 for best on best.
Yeah, that was the last time that the NHL sent players to a tournament overseas. I believe. I mean, that's when Joe Pavelski was Captain America. That's when he was the captain of the U.S. team.
Yeah, and so kind of bringing that up is kind of, I mentioned the ESPN where they were talking about the All-Star game. Why can't they do what World Cup of Hockey does? Well, I'm like, what Four Nations was doing. And Four Nations took the place of the All-Star game. And I do think it has a broader reach to other people. And I do think we talked about like, okay, people love this. Are they going to actually come back? I think if it's a reoccurring thing, they'll start to get slowly invested. But I was trying to think of the name of this. So 1 year will be Four Nations of Hockey, no All-Star game. I think the next year is going to be the All-Star game. Then it says the 2028 World Cup of Hockey will be held in February 2028. So I'm wondering if they're going to do similar to what they did with Four Nations.
Well, the World Cup of Hockey happens always in February. It's just the NHL doesn't send their teams to it. But
okay,
I'm excited for that, and I want to ask you: is the Four Nations now every year that the Olympics or World Cup of Hockey doesn't happen is when it's going to happen? Like, is it going to happen the next time in 2027 and in 2029 and basically every odd year, so that you have All-Star game for the Olympics and the World Cup of Hockey, but then you don't have it for the Four Nations, and that's how you do every year from now on? So you have a tournament, a international tournament, no matter what year it is.
Yeah, that's what
I
think they're doing, which I'm excited to hear about. So I kind of like the idea of international play, because you talked about NHL not sending people. They just didn't send people for the Olympics in the past. In like 2022, it was COVID. I like the idea of Four Nations. It gets people used to an international break, and you kind of get Four Nations.
I do think that the way they did it, by having the Four Nations this year and then doing the Olympics next year, that I think has more people hyped for the Olympics now. I do think that's a good preface, because now people are going to be like, I can't wait for the Olympics. And now I couldn't wait before the Four Nations, but now from what I understand, everything I understand, they are returning to the Olympics. Now, I am in a state of I'll believe it when I see it. That's definitely how I am, because they said that in 2022 and then opted out. But I think this is a good preface, and I think this has done a lot of good for the sport. And I think the Olympics will continue to bring more people to the sport of hockey, and then inherently to the NHL as well.
Yeah, I agree with you. And it was just a perfect sort of events combined with like the NBA All-Star game. I still stand by. I'm like, it doesn't make sense, but NHL as a brand, it helps, because, okay, I'm going to have an international tournament. Then there's the All-Star game, which will be like, okay, what are they going to do? But you're going to be like, well, I don't have to see that again for like another 3 or 4 years, because then it's going to be Four Nations back. So I do think it kind of like, you still have the list of All-Stars, but it's just like, I don't have to see him play. I get to see something more exciting. where I think it has a broader reach than what a normal All-Star game.
What I think some people were confusing it with was that the Four Nations was the All-Star game. It wasn't that's why it was in place of the All-Star game, but it wasn't the All-Star game. People were like, and I understand people who don't follow hockey having questions like this, but they were like, does that mean that only players from those four nations could make the All-Star team? No, that's not. It wasn't like, and I understand why they think that because it is in place of the All-Star game, but it's not an All-Star game. That's not what it is. It's completely separate. It has its own trophy. It's its own tournament. There's 7 games for a champion to finally be announced. And I think that, next year they're going to have an All-Star game from what I understand. And I think also in the World Cup of Hockey year, they're also going to have an All-Star game. I think the years that they're not going to have the All-Star game are the years of the Four Nations.
Okay. Interesting. I would be okay if the All-Star game, like, they kind of slowly let it go away. Because, I'm not a big fan of All-Star games, and this is more exciting for it. But I do agree, because you don't have to do much with Four Nations. Like, we kind of talk about, like, a new thing. Like, you talk about the NBA Cup. Like, oh, they need to work on this. But Four Nations is just like, well, let's do this again.
Zero problems. I mean, there's nothing else I would add to it. I mean, the only thing I would add is more countries, but at that point, it's not Four Nations. It's a different tournament. So I'm totally fine. If they decide to do this every 2 years, right, because it would be 2027, 2029. If they did this every 2 years, I'm there every day. I'm there every day that they have it. So I'm in 2026, I'm taking this straight off of ESPN's article. The NHL has announced what is on the way in 2026. The All-Star Weekend, which took a hiatus in favor of the Four Nations this year, will return at the New York Islanders UBS Arena next February. It will serve as a Bon Voyage event ahead of the 2026 Olympics in Italy. So basically, I think that's what's going to happen at the World Cup of Hockey and the Olympics years. But then for the Four Nations, they're not going to have the All-Star game. They're just going to have the Four Nations tournament. That's what I think is going to happen.
That makes sense. And as long I like the idea of international play because the players just get so into it. And like you can tell that from a fan standpoint. And that just makes it so much more engaging. But I think the future looks pretty nice because like as you can just do copy paste, which I think is something like this worked. We're just going to do it again. And I do think it's going to affect the Olympics. Like, okay, because Brady Tkachuk is young, right? So was he always going to be on like the USA Olympic team?
He was.
Okay, he was. But I'm curious, like, okay, well, this guy, let's put him in there. And I know someone mentioned Jim Nell was looking at it for like, okay, these are some players we could add. But I do think it helps with the Olympic and just kind of building that camaraderie and just kind of between the fans, like, oh, I know this guy. I know Austin Matthews missed those shots in the final, but maybe he makes it up again against Canada.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, you're talking about Tkachuk. I don't think that your international team needs to have technically the best players, per se. It's just the best group of players. Having Tkachuk and Tkachuk on the same line, headman in the middle by Austin Matthews, pure cinema. I mean, that's the best version of hockey. I mean, it's really at its purest form. Because they're laying bodies, but also you have a pure goal scorer in Austin Matthews. It's just a perfect set of circumstances for a great team. I mean, they are so intense about these games, and I do find it extremely enjoyable watching it because, I mean, it's something that you're right, we are missing in the NBA. Even though it's not fair to compare, we are missing this in the NBA, would you say?
Just kind of like non-playoff game where you feel the intensity.
It's because they try to use. You mentioned this. They try to do this with the in-season tournament, like you said, and it just doesn't feel anywhere near.
Yeah, like the NBA, if they did something like this, where we're going to take a break, doesn't affect the standings. But it's more out of like, okay, we're going to have these guys competing. And I only really think it's outside of playoffs. Like it seems like countries make sense and it's not an important game. in the point of standings and just getting to the playoffs, I feel country makes sense because there's a pride with the country. No matter what's going on, the players were like, I want to beat Canada. And Canada's like, we want to beat US.
Yeah, it's deeper than so in college football, there's I don't even remember the name of the two teams in the rivalry, but the name of the rivalry is deeper than hate. I'm gonna search it up, but that's really what I think of every time I think about it. It's almost inherent to the sport for these teams to hate each other.
Yeah, no, I think that's something that's just generated with the Four Nations and a great idea. You got it?
Yeah, it's Appalachian State, Georgia State. So in a college football dynasty, I was App State, and I knew there was this rivalry. I just couldn't remember the two teams in it, but yeah, the App State Georgia Southern game is known as deeper than hate. But that's how I see these two teams when they play each other. It's more than that, and you can see it when they fight each other, but also the intensity when they win and lose.
Yeah. So that kind of concludes. I like the format of this, and I'm very interested in the future. I'll let you close this one out.
Yeah, thank you guys for listening. Please let us know what you guys think about the future of the Four Nations, the impact of it, and what you guys would like to see in the future.